Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the medieval kitchen, a place where gourmet meant anything that didn't bite back too hard. You probably wouldn't survive, let's be honest, because your avocado toast obsession just wouldn't fly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a muddy track, the kind that sucks at your worn leather shoes with every step. The air is cold, not just a brisk autumn chill, but a damp, penetrating cold that seems to cling to your very bones, seeping through the coarse weave of your tunic. You pull your cloak tighter, but it offers little comfort. Look around you. The trees are gaunt, their branches skeletal against a perpetually overcast sky. Smoke, thin and gray, curls from the chimneys of a distant, huddled village, carrying the faint scent of burning peat and something else. Something like old, damp wool. This is the world where our story begins. A world where the primary overwhelming concern that wakes you in the morning and haunts your dreams at night is food. Not what kind of food, not whether it's organic or gluten-free, or if it pairs well with a cheeky little Chardonnay. No, simply, is there food? And more often than not, the answer is a grim, echoing, not enough. You feel that familiar, hollow ache in your belly, a constant companion. It's a dull throb that sometimes sharpens into a painful cramp, a reminder that your body is running on fumes. This isn't the fleeting hunger you might feel before lunch, the kind that a quick snack can easily vanquish. This is a deep, chronic emptiness, a state of being for so many in the medieval period. The modern luxury of 3 square meals a day, of pantries stocked and refrigerators full, would seem like an impossible dream. A fairy tale told by a madman. You walk through your day, and every sight, every sound is filtered through the lens of this hunger, that bird singing in the tree. Not a charming melody, but a fleeting scrap of potential protein. Those plants growing by the wayside. Not weeds, but a desperate hope for something, anything, to boil in a pot. Survival here isn't a dramatic once-in-a-lifetime event. It's a daily grind, a relentless battle against starvation. And in this battle, necessity isn't just the mother of invention. She's the head chef, the menu planner, and the fearsome enforcer of her culinary dictates. The concept of weird food as we understand it, something exotic, unusual, perhaps a delicacy from a faraway land tried on a dare, simply doesn't compute in the same way. When your stomach is screaming and your children are looking at you with those wide, hungry eyes, the definition of edible becomes astonishingly flexible. Your sophisticated modern palate, the one that can distinguish between 7 types of artisanal cheese. It would be a liability here. You'd quickly learn to appreciate the subtle nuances of boiled nettles, or the earthy tang of a roasted root you wouldn't normally give a second glance. Imagine the sheer precariousness of it all. Your entire community, your family's survival, hinges on the harvest, and the harvest hinges on the weather. A fickle and often cruel master, a late frost, a summer of relentless rain, or a sudden, parching drought could mean the difference between a meager sufficiency and outright famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, Nahun, for instance, Tadamurt, was a truly devastating period across much of Europe. Persistent, torrential rains year after year led to catastrophic crop failures. People ate their seed grain, a desperate act that sealed their fate for the following year. Livestock perished or were consumed. The accounts from this time paint a grim picture of societies pushed to the absolute brink. A stark reminder that the veneer of civilization is perilously thin when the food runs out. There was no global food network, no emergency aid shipments from across the seas. There was just the failing land and the gnawing hunger. So, when we talk about a strange menu, we're not being judgmental from our lofty 21st century perch, at least, not entirely. We're acknowledging that the food landscape was dictated by what you could hunt, forage, or grow, and when those failed, what you could find. The forest, the river, even the hedgerows became crucial larders, and the items on offer weren't always appealing by our standards. Think less, Master Chef, and more, man versus wild, but without the camera crew or the comforting knowledge that a hot meal awaits offset. It's kind of funny, in a dark way, to imagine a medieval peasant's reaction to a modern cooking show. You're throwing away the carrot tops. Are you insane? Historians still argue whether the average peasant's diet was truly as monotonous as commonly portrayed, or if regional variations and foraging provided more diversity than records suggest. While the mainstays were often coarse, dark bread, sometimes called maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, and pottage, a sort of ever-simmering stew where yesterday's leftovers met today's foraged finds. The foraged finds part is where things could get inventive. This pottage wasn't your grandma's comforting chicken soup, unless a scrawny chicken happened to fall into it by accident. More likely, it was a concoction of whatever grains, beans, and vegetables were available, thickened with oats or breadcrumbs, and seasoned with wild herbs if you were lucky. And when times were truly dire, the definition of ingredients expanded considerably. This is where we encounter a rather unappetizing but resourceful culinary adaptation. It wasn't uncommon for people during severe famines to create famine bread, which could be made from a rather startling array of materials like ground acorns after laborious leaching to remove toxins, chestnuts, bark from certain trees, chaff, straw, dried leaves, or even powdered roots of plants usually considered inedible. Can you imagine the texture of bread made with a significant portion of sawdust or straw? It probably had all the delightful chewiness of a mouthful of gravel. But if it kept you alive, if it filled that aching void in your stomach even for a little while, you ate it. You were probably even grateful for it. It makes our complaints about slightly stale bread seem rather trivial, doesn't it? The pressure to find food was immense. Every scrap had value. Bones weren't just tossed aside. They were boiled and reboiled to extract every last bit of marrow and gelatin, flavoring the pottage or providing a thin, yet precious mold broth. Nothing that could remotely be consumed was wasted. This wasn't a philosophical stance on sustainability. It was a harsh, practical reality. Your life depended on your ability to make the most of absolutely everything. So, as we prepare to explore some of the specific items that graced or disgraced the medieval table, try to keep this backdrop in mind. The weirdness is entirely relative. It's born not of a desire for novelty, but of a desperate, clawing need to survive. The strange menu that began to form wasn't about culinary adventure. It was about human resilience, ingenuity, and the stark, often brutal realities of a world where hunger was a constant, unwelcome guest at every table. If you were lucky enough to even have a table, the soft glow of your screen, the gentle hum of your fan. These are comforts those who ate from survival's strange menu could scarcely imagine. Their world was one of flickering rushlights, damp, smoky air, and the ever-present, gnawing question, what will we eat tomorrow? You've left the relative comfort of that, shall we say, optimistically managed field we just imagined, like we touched on when things got a bit sparse. The grain stores, Remember them? They're looking a bit sad, a bit echoey. So, where do you turn your gaze and your increasingly insistent stomach? Drift beyond the neatly or not so neatly plowed furrows. You're heading into the liminal spaces, the hedgerows, the verges of the forest, the marshy bits everyone else tries to avoid. This is the domain of the forager, the realm where weed becomes lunch. You see, what we now call weeds, those tenacious little plants that pop up in our perfectly manicured lawns and pristine flower beds, much to the chagrin of our homeowners association, were often vital. Your ancestors, with their rather more pressing concern of, not starving, had a very different relationship with dandelions, nettles, and plantain. You might wrinkle your nose at the thought of a dandelion salad today. Maybe picking out the bitter greens if someone tries to serve you one at a fancy farm-to-table restaurant. But back then, those bright yellow flowers weren't just a cheerful sign of spring. They were a signal that free, vitamin-rich food was pushing its way up through the thawing earth. It's amazing how a rumbling tummy can change your culinary preferences, isn't it? Imagine yourself, basket in hand, or maybe just an old sack, scanning the ground. Your eyes are sharp, trained to spot the specific curl of a young fern frond, a fiddlehead, before it unfurls into its less palatable, tougher adult form. You know to look for the tender young leaves of stinging nettles, carefully harvested ouch because, once blanched or cooked, that sting disappears, leaving behind something surprisingly like spinach, packed with iron and vitamins. It's a bit like playing a real-life version of Stardew Valley, except the penalty for eating the wrong mushroom is significantly higher, and you don't get a cute little Junimo to help you, or a handy undo button. The ground beneath your worn leather shoes, or perhaps just your bare feet, is cool and damp in the early morning. Dew still clings to the clover, another plant often on the menu. You're not just looking for leaves, though. Your hands, calloused and knowing, dig into the soil, seeking out roots and tubers. Burdock root, for instance. Today, you might find it in some health food stores, prized for its earthy flavor. Back then, it was a substantial, starchy addition to the pot, something to give a thin soup a bit more body. It's a bit like a parsnip that's been hitting the gym and has a slightly grumpier attitude. You know the type. And then there are the less obvious candidates, acorns. Now, you can't just pick an acorn off the ground and pop it in your mouth like a trail mixy almond. Oh no, they are incredibly bitter, full of tannins. But people knew how to process them, leaching them in running water, or boiling them multiple times, to make them edible. It was a laborious process, but when the alternative was an empty belly, you found the time. It's a well-documented historical fact that acorn meal was a staple for many indigenous cultures across the globe. And in times of extreme scarcity, Europeans also resorted to this practice, particularly in regions like Iberia. The effort was worth the calories and the sustenance. Even if it wasn't exactly gourmet, you'd also be keeping an eye out for things like wild sorrel, with its lemony tang, a welcome burst of flavor in an otherwise bland diet, or chickweed, a delicate little plant that could be eaten raw or cooked. These weren't Michelin star experiences. Mind you, we're talking survival, but vital nutrients. Absolutely. Think about scurvy, that dreaded sailor's disease, but also a very real threat to landlocked populations if fresh greens weren't available for extended periods. Those foraged plants, rich in vitamin C, could literally be lifesavers. A little patch of ground ivy could be the difference between making it through winter and not. Now, here's a slightly quirky, lesser-known tidbit. Some communities developed a taste for, or at least a tolerance for, plants that were mildly toxic if not prepared correctly. such as the roots of Solomon's seal. While beautiful in the garden, its rhizomes contain compounds that can cause nausea if not properly cooked, often by boiling them through multiple changes of water. It's a high-stakes cooking experiment, isn't it? Did I boil it long enough? Or will my tongue feel like it's auditioning for a role as a pincushion? Talk about dinner and a show? With potentially unpleasant audience participation. The forest floor itself becomes a larder. You push aside damp leaves, your nose twitching, trying to catch the scent of wild mushrooms. This, of course, is where things get particularly dicey. There's a saying, there are old mushroom hunters, and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters. Distinguishing the delicious chanterelle from its less friendly, or downright deadly lookalikes like the jack-o'-lantern mushroom required incredible skill, passed down through generations. Get it wrong, and well, your foraging days are over, permanently. It's not like they had a handy app for mushroom identification, or a helpful park ranger to consult every 5 minutes. It was pure, hard-won knowledge, and probably a few unfortunate family stories. And it wasn't just about what was obviously edible. People learned to exploit every part of a plant. The inner bark of certain trees, like slippery elm or some pine species, could be ground into a flower extender during truly desperate times. It wouldn't win any culinary awards, and probably tasted like, well, tree bark, perhaps with a hint of existential dread. But it could bulk out a meager bread ration. You can imagine the texture, a bit gritty, a bit woody. Still, better than the gnawing emptiness. Consider the sheer amount of knowledge required. You need to know not just what to pick, but when to pick it. Nettles are best young. Many roots are more tender in spring or fall before the plant flowers and diverts its energy. You need to know where to look, which plants prefer shade, which thrive in sunny clearings, which hug the water's edge. This wasn't casual knowledge. It was a deeply ingrained understanding of the local ecosystem, a mental map of resources that changed with the seasons, more detailed than any GPS. And the reliance on these wild foods wasn't just a Dark Ages thing, a trope we often fall into, even into more recent historical periods. During famines, wars, or sieges, people turned back to the wild. Think of the siege of Leningrad during World War II, where citizens foraged for anything remotely edible, including wallpaper paste made from potato starch, if they were lucky, or boiled leather if they weren't. It underscores how fragile the food supply could be, even with supposedly advanced agriculture. This brings us to a point of ongoing discussion. Historians still argue whether the general populace in, say, the medieval period, maintained a consistent, widespread level of foraging knowledge as a daily supplement, or if this knowledge became more specialized, perhaps held primarily by women or the very poorest members of society, only to be more widely readopted and remembered during times of acute crisis. Was it an everyday part of the dietary background hum, or more like an emergency broadcast system for the stomach? The records are often sparse on such mundane, domestic details, focusing more on the grand tapestries of battles and kings than on what the average peasant woman was quietly gathering to put in her stew pot. You're also dealing with plants that modern society actively tries to eradicate. Think about Japanese knotweed. Today, it's an invasive nightmare, incredibly difficult to get rid of, the bane of gardeners and property owners. But some sources suggest its young shoots are edible, with a taste similar to rhubarb when cooked. One wonders if, in a different context, its aggressive, irrepressible growth might have been seen as a reliable, if slightly pushy and overenthusiastic, food source. Well, Agnes, the knotweed is back with a vengeance, but at least we'll have pie. Again, a little culinary optimism, or perhaps resignation. There. The act of foraging is slow, methodical. It's not like striding into a supermarket with its brightly lit aisles of pre-washed, prepackaged plenty. You spend hours, your back aching, your fingers stained and scratched, for what might seem like a small reward. A handful of berries here, a few roots there, but each item adds to the collective pot. Each calorie is precious. It connects you directly to the land, to the cycle of growth and decay, in a way that even tilling a field, for all its hard work, doesn't quite capture. This is a more intimate, almost secretive relationship with nature's pantry. You learn to read the landscape for signs, not just of edible plants, but also of potential dangers. Where certain plants grow might indicate the soil type, or the presence of water, or even the passage of animals. It's a holistic understanding, far removed from our modern, often compartmentalized knowledge, where the botany department and the zoology department rarely have lunch together. And these foraged items weren't just about staving off starvation. They also provided medicinal benefits, whether intentionally sought or as a happy side effect. Many of the plants we've mentioned, dandelion, plantain, yarrow, have long histories in traditional herbal medicine. So, your foraged meal might also be helping to soothe a cough, reduce inflammation, or aid digestion, even if you weren't fully conscious of its dual purpose. A sort of two-for-one deal, nature's little BOGO offer. So as you straighten up, your basket a little heavier, the sun a little higher in the sky, you feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. It's not the bounty of a full harvest, not by a long shot, but it's something. It's the resilience of human ingenuity, the ability to find sustenance even when the plowed fields offer little hope. It's a testament to the quiet, persistent wisdom of those who knew how to look beyond the obvious, to find life in the overlooked corners of the world. And honestly, after all that, you'd probably really appreciate a slice of that knotweed pie, no matter how pushy the plant might be about its continued existence. So, the prime cuts are sorted, perhaps already destined for a spit or a stew pot, like we talked about with those slow cooking methods. But now, you notice the work isn't nearly done. There's a whole other category of, well, ingredients, patiently waiting their turn. These are the bits that, shall we say, don't often make the highlight reel on modern cooking shows, unless it's one of those very earnest, very bearded chef things. We're diving deep into the world of the unloved, the unsung, the utterly indispensable parts of the animal. Welcome to the original nose-to-tail philosophy, born not from culinary trendiness, but from sheer, unadulterated necessity. And honestly, some of it is surprisingly delicious. Once you get past the initial introduction, you watch as the internal organs, the offal, are carefully handled. The liver, dark and rich, might be fried up quickly with some foraged onions, a potent source of iron. Your modern-day liver and onions, a direct descendant, though perhaps with less rustic charm. The kidneys, too, have their place, often soaked to mellow their strong flavor before being tucked into pies or stews. The heart, a dense, muscular organ, is surprisingly lean as adults, when slow cooked, becomes wonderfully tender. It's a bit like finding out the toughest looking guy in the village actually writes poetry. Then you encounter the stomach, or tripe, as you might know it. Its honeycomb texture can be a bit challenging for the uninitiated. You see it being meticulously cleaned, a process that's absolutely crucial. Once prepared, it might be simmered for hours, absorbing the flavors of herbs and broth, transforming into something soft and yielding. Think of it as the ultimate culinary glow-up, from, well, a stomach to a comforting, savory dish. Across many cultures, tripe has been a staple, from Italian trippa alla romana to Mexican menudo. It's a testament to human ingenuity. Really, looking at a stomach lining and thinking, yes, I can make dinner out of that. Okay, and the intestines. Oh, they're not going anywhere. Cleaned thoroughly, these become the natural casings for sausages, a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. The Romans, for instance, were quite partial to sausages, or lucanica, a fact that brings a little classical dignity to the humble banger. So, as you see these long, slippery tubes being prepared, remember that every time you enjoy a good quality sausage, you're participating in an ancient culinary art. Sometimes less glamorous parts of the intestines, like chitterlings, are braised or fried, a true exercise in waste not, want not. Historians still argue whether the deep-rooted traditions of preparing chitterlings in some communities were purely a result of making do with scraps, or if a genuine culinary preference for their unique texture and flavor developed over time, independent of economic pressures. Now, let's talk about blood. Yes, blood. Before you recoil and reach for your artisanal sourdough, remember that blood is incredibly nutritious, packed with protein and iron. You see it being carefully collected, not a drop wasted. This isn't for some dramatic vampiric ritual. It's for sustenance. It becomes the star in dishes like black pudding or blood sausage, mixed with grains, fat, and spices, then cooked until firm. The taste is rich, earthy, and surprisingly complex. You might even see it used as a thickener for stews, adding depth and a velvety texture. It's a bit like using a secret ingredient that your fancy foodie friends haven't discovered yet, unless they're really into historical reenactment. And just when you thought things couldn't get more glamorous, we arrive at the feet and ears. Pig's trotters, cow's feet, even chicken feet. They might not look like much, but they are collagen powerhouses. You see them being scrubbed clean, perhaps singed a little to remove any stray hairs, simmered for a long time. They release all that wonderful gelatin, creating broths that set into a rich jelly when cooled, or adding an unctuous, lip-smacking quality to stews. Think of it as the original bone broth, but with more personality. A quirky little tidbit for you: in some medieval European households, boiled calves' feet, once jellied and spiced, were considered quite a refined dish, almost a delicacy. So much for humble beginnings. The ears, often from pigs, might be boiled until tender and then fried or roasted until crispy. Imagine the most intense, porky crackling, but with a chewy, cartilaginous layer. It's a textural adventure, to say the least. Your dog might enjoy a dried pig's ear as a treat today, but back then, these were valuable calories for humans. Snouts, too, and tails would be simmered down, adding their unique flavors and textures to the pot. It's a far cry from a neatly packaged pork chop, isn't it? But every single piece had a purpose. Even the bones, as we touched upon earlier with stews, are prized, cracked open after boiling. The marrow within is a rich, fatty treat, spread on a piece of coarse bread or stirred into the pot for extra flavor. It's pure, unadulterated umami, long before that word even entered the popular lexicon. And the rendered fat, the lard or tallow, carefully skimmed and stored, becomes the primary cooking medium, a source of flavor, and even a way to preserve other foods. Like confit, it's liquid gold in a pre-vegetable oil world. You also see the skin, if not used for leather, being rendered for cracklings or boiled and added to dishes for texture, especially pork skin. Nothing is discarded carelessly. Every snip, every scrape, every simmered morsel is part of a larger understanding the animal gave its life, and in return, every part of it would sustain life. These weren't just occasional oddities. For many, these unloved bits were the regular, reliable sources of protein and fat that kept them going. They formed the backbone of peasant cuisines across the globe, dishes born of thrift that often, through sheer ingenuity and flavor, transcended their humble origins to become celebrated regional specialties. You begin to understand that the concept of waste is a modern luxury, one our ancestors simply couldn't afford. They weren't just being frugal, they were being profoundly respectful, in their own way, of the resources available to them. It makes you look at that shrink-wrapped chicken breast in the supermarket a little differently, doesn't it? Now, shifting our gaze upwards, away from the grunts and rustles in the undergrowth we were just exploring, you find your attention drawn to the skies, to the flutter and chirp of, well, dinner. We're not talking about plump, domesticated chickens or fat geese here. Not yet. We're diving into the realm of the truly opportunistic, the winged wonders of the wild that, for many, were less a choice and more a necessity, or perhaps even a fleeting, tiny delicacy. Think sparrows, pigeons, rooks. Basically, if it had feathers and you could somehow get your hands on it, it was on the menu. You imagine the patience required, the stillness. Catching these smaller birds wasn't about a grand hunt. It was about cunning and making do. Remember how we talked about the sheer effort involved in procuring some of those larger land animals? Well, here, the effort is different, more intricate, perhaps more frustrating. You picture someone, maybe a child, tasked with setting snares made of horsehair or daubing sticky birdlime on branches, a messy, tricky business. The yield from a single sparrow is, let's be honest, minimal. You'd need a flock the size of a particularly enthusiastic and perhaps slightly unhinged Twitter mob to make a decent mouthful, yet every calorie counted. These tiny morsels, often roasted whole on skewers over a smoky fire, would have offered a burst of gamey flavor, a fleeting crunch of tiny bones. You can almost taste the slightly charred skin, the surprisingly intense flavor packed into such a small package. It's a far cry from a modern chicken nugget, isn't it? Though, arguably, with slightly more transparent ingredients. Then you have pigeons. Now, these are a bit more substantial, and before you wrinkle your nose thinking of the slightly bedraggled city pigeons, you might see pecking at discarded chips. Remember that for centuries, pigeons, or more specifically, their young, called squabs, were highly prized. This isn't just a rustic make-do. We're talking about a food source actively cultivated. It's a well-documented historical fact that throughout the medieval period and beyond, dovecotes, those often beautiful, specially constructed houses for pigeons, were a common feature on estates and manors. They were a status symbol, sure, but more importantly, they provided a reliable source of fresh meat, especially during the lean winter months when other livestock might have been slaughtered and preserved. You can almost see the fluttering cloud of birds around a stone dovecote, a constant, self-replenishing larder. These weren't your tough, streetwise city birds. These were plump, carefully managed squabs. The taste would be rich, tender, a dark meat that, even today, graces the tables of high-end restaurants. So, before they were delivering passive-aggressive notes in fantasy novels or acting as feathered urban refuse collectors, they were delivering themselves, quite conveniently, to the dinner table. And here's a quirky little tidbit for you. Those dovecotes weren't just about the meat. Pigeon droppings, or guano, were an incredibly valuable fertilizer, rich in nitrates and phosphates. So, owning a dovecote was a win-win. You got your Sunday roast, and the means to make your crops flourish. Talk about a sustainable farming initiative, centuries ahead of its time. You can imagine the lord of the manor beaming with pride at his dual income birds. Moving on to the larger, perhaps more formidable members of the corvid family. Rooks, crows, maybe even the occasional jackdaw if things were desperate. These birds are intelligent, wary, and not exactly known for their delicate flavor. You picture them, glossy black against a gray sky, their caws echoing across the fields. Eating them was often a pragmatic decision. Rooks, in particular, could be agricultural pests, feasting on newly sown seeds or grains. So, turning them into rook pie wasn't just about finding food, it was also a form of pest control. You can imagine a farmer shaking his fist at a sky full of rooks, then thoughtfully rubbing his chin and heading inside to consult a recipe. The preparation would be key. Older birds could be tough and stringy, their flesh dark and intensely gamey. Some say they were an acquired taste, perhaps requiring the kind of culinary optimism that only true hunger, or a very good sauce, can inspire. Young rooks, taken from the nest, were considered more palatable. You might find them baked into pies with a thick pastry crust. The strong flavor mellowed somewhat by other ingredients like bacon or mushrooms, if you were lucky enough to have them. Beyond these specific examples, the guiding principle was often whatever could be caught or trapped. This speaks volumes about resourcefulness. Think of long, cold winters or times of famine. Any bird, no matter how small or unconventional, represented calories, protein, survival. Songbirds, thrushes, blackbirds, fieldfares, all were potential additions to the pot. Nets would be strung across hedgerows, ingenious traps laid. You see children, small and nimble, being particularly adept at this kind of foraging. Their sharp eyes spotting nests, their quick hands setting snares. It's a slightly sobering thought, the idea of a beautiful songbird ending its days as part of a meager stew. But it reflects the harsh realities of life for many. Historians still argue whether the eventual decline in the widespread consumption of smaller songbirds was primarily due to changing culinary tastes, the increasing availability of other meats, or the nascent stirrings of early conservationist sentiment. Perhaps it was a little of all three. You can almost hear the debate in a dusty university common room, fueled by lukewarm tea and strong opinions. The sensory experience of preparing these wild birds would have been quite distinct. The slightly acrid smell of singeing feathers as they were plucked or burned off over a flame. The intricate work of drawing such small creatures, a task requiring a delicate touch. The aroma of them roasting or stewing, often mixed with wild herbs gathered nearby. Thyme, rosemary, sage, anything to enhance the flavor or mask any overly strong gaminess. It's a far cry from shrink-wrapped portions in a supermarket aisle. Isn't it? There's an intimacy with the source of your food that we've largely lost. A direct connection born of necessity. You're not just consuming a meal. You're consuming the result of your own cunning, your patience, your understanding of the natural world around you. And maybe, just maybe, a tiny bit of gratitude for whatever the wild decided to provide that day, no matter how small or feathered. So, you've gathered what you can from the hedgerows, and perhaps, if you're lucky, managed to snag something more substantial from the woods we just wandered through. But now, your attention, and indeed your stomach, might guide you towards the glint of water in the distance, the local river, a lifeline, especially when other larders are looking a bit sparse. You find yourself standing by the bank, the air thick with the damp, earthy smell of silt and decaying leaves, a scent that's both ancient and ever-present. The water itself, well, it's not exactly crystal clear. Is it more of a murky, swirling brown, hinting at the hidden life, and perhaps a fair bit of mud beneath its surface? This is where resourcefulness, like we've seen in so many other aspects of daily survival, truly comes into its own. When the sea is a distant dream, or the Lord's well-stocked fish ponds are strictly off-limits unless you fancy a rather unpleasant encounter with his bailiff. The humble river and its often overlooked inhabitants become your focus. Your gaze first falls upon the sinuous, almost unnervingly alive shapes that thrive in these water eels. You might see woven wicker traps or eel bucks strategically placed in the current, their funnel-shaped entrances inviting these slippery creatures in, with no easy way out. Sometimes, at night, you'd see the flicker of a torch and the quick dart of a spear, eel spearing, a skill requiring patience and a surprisingly steady hand. Once caught, these aren't your elegant sushi bar unagi. Not yet, anyway. They're muscular, writhing, and covered in a layer of slime that makes handling them a unique tactile experience. You reach in to grab one, and it's like trying to wrestle with a length of greased lightning. It's a true art to get a firm grip. Eels were incredibly important, a reliable source of protein, often salted or smoked for preservation. Their rich, oily flesh a welcome change from, say, endless gruel. In fact, they were so valued that, in some areas, tenants would actually pay part of their rent in eels. Imagine that appearing on your monthly dues. Hundreds of wriggling eels delivered to the landlord's door, probably made for an interesting accounting ledger. Then there are the lampreys. Oh, the lamprey, looking somewhat like an eel, but with that distinctive, frankly terrifying, circular mouth filled with rows of sharp teeth. These jawless fish have a certain prehistoric charm. You'd find them attaching themselves to other fish, but humans found them quite attachable to the dinner plate, especially royalty. They were considered a delicacy, a status symbol even. The most famous, or perhaps infamous, consumer of lampreys was King Henry I of England, who is said to have died in 1135 from a savoir-faire surfeit of lampreys. Essentially, he ate too many. His physicians had warned him against it. But kings, as you know, often do as they please. It makes you wonder if they were that good, or if he just really, really liked proving his doctors wrong. One final, delicious, and ultimately fatal act of defiance. Preparing them often involved stewing them in wine and their own blood. A rich and, one assumes, intensely flavored dish. Beyond these more prized catches, the river offers up a host of what we might call less desirable fish. You're talking about the commoners of the aquatic world: pike, carp, roach, dace, bream, perch. These aren't the flaky, delicate white fish you might find at a high-end restaurant today. Many are bony. Their flesh can be muddy tasting, especially if they're pulled from slow-moving, silty waters. You'd need a bit of culinary ingenuity here. Think long, slow cooking in stews, heavily seasoned with whatever herbs and spices you could find. Perhaps some wild garlic from the riverbank, or mustard if you were a bit better off. The goal was often to tenderize the flesh and, frankly, to overpower any lingering river bottom notes. They say hunger is the best spice, and with some of these fish, you'd certainly need a generous helping of hunger, or actual potent spices. Historians still argue whether the elaborate medieval recipes for spicing and saucing these freshwater fish were genuinely about celebrating their unique qualities, or simply a very determined effort to make them palatable enough to swallow without wincing too much. And it doesn't stop with fish. You'd also turn your attention to the smaller creatures, the ones that require even more patience to gather. You might see people, often children or the elderly, carefully combing the shallows and muddy banks for anything edible. Crayfish, those miniature freshwater lobsters, would be a welcome find. Their sweet meat a little reward for the effort of catching and peeling them. You'd need quite a few to make a meal, though. Then there are freshwater mussels, though one had to be careful about where they were harvested from, as some could be, well, let's just say they could lead to an upset stomach. a rather unwelcome addition to the daily struggle. And yes, in some regions, frog's legs would have been on the menu, a tradition that persists in some cuisines today. You can imagine someone with a long stick patiently trying to nab a plump frog from a lily pad. It's a far cry from a haunch of venison. But when times are tough, protein is protein. Even snails, plucked from damp reeds or the underside of stones, could be gathered, starved for a few days to clean them out, and then boiled or roasted. Spending half a day to gather a handful of river snails, truly the pinnacle of slow food, long before it became a trendy hashtag. It really underscores that principle we've touched on before. No potential food source was too humble or too much trouble when the alternative was going without. The river, then, is more than just a picturesque feature of the landscape. It's a dynamic, sometimes challenging, but ultimately vital source of sustenance. It's your backup plan, your emergency larder, the place you turn to when the forests are bare and the fields have yielded all they can. You learn its moods, its secrets, the best spots for a hopeful cast of a net or the patient setting of a trap, the smell of wood smoke mingling with the damp scent of the river, the flickering torchlight on the water at dusk. These are the sights and smells of survival, of making do, of drawing life from the very bed of the river and bringing it, with ingenuity and often a great deal of effort, to the table. It's a constant reminder that even in the most ordinary seeming places, life and the means to sustain it can be found if you just know where and how to look. You just have to be willing to get your hands, and probably your feet, a little bit muddy. Right. So after you've scoured the hedgerows for those last, slightly questionable berries, and the riverbank for anything remotely edible, your gaze, sharpened by that gnawing emptiness we've touched upon, might just drop a little lower, down to the damp earth, the undersides of leaves, the mossy bark of trees. We're entering the realm of crawling and, yes, often slimy sustenance. It's not exactly the feasting hall, but in times of true grinding famine, your definition of had, food, becomes remarkably flexible. You see that glistening trail on a cool, dewy morning. That's not just a sign of a garden pest. In desperate times, it's a potential, albeit slow-moving, protein packet. We're talking about snails. Now, before your modern sensibilities recoil too much, remember that the Romans absolutely adored snails. They even farmed them in special enclosures called cochlearia, fattening them up on milk and wine-soaked bread. So, there's a historical precedent, a certain culinary pedigree, if you will, even if it's a long way from a silver platter to a muddy handful. Finding them isn't usually the hard part, especially after a good rain. You'd scan the damp spots, turn over rocks and fallen logs, each one a tiny, shelled morsel. But you can't just pop them in your mouth like a forgotten grape. Oh no, there's a process. First, you'd likely collect a fair few, keeping them in a pot or a tightly woven basket. Then comes the purging. This is crucial because snails eat all sorts of things, some of which might not agree with your already stressed digestive system. For several days, sometimes up to a week, you'd keep them contained, often feeding them something bland like flour, bran, or specific herbs, a bit like a spa day for the snail. Except the final treatment is, well, final. This helps clear out their digestive tracts. Some believed certain herbs, like thyme or fennel, not only purged them, but also improved their flavor. A little gourmet touch in the face of starvation. Once purged, the preparation is usually straightforward. Boiling is common. Perhaps roasting them in their shells directly on embers if you have a fire going. You'd need a pin or a sharp twig to winkle the meat out of the shell. The texture, well, it's often described as chewy, a bit like mushroom or squid, depending on the cooking. And yes, there's a certain earthiness. It's not a feast, but it's calories, it's protein. And when your children are looking at you with those hollow eyes, the slight sliminess is a minor inconvenience. You'd be surprised what you can get used to. People still eat escargot today, swimming in garlic butter, a delicacy. For your medieval counterpart, it was less about garlic butter and more about basic survival. Now, if snails are testing your culinary boundaries, let's talk about their shellless cousins, slugs. Even more of a desperation food, you'd imagine. They carry a similar risk of parasites if not cooked thoroughly, and the slime factor is, shall we say, amplified. There's no convenient shell to hold onto. No neat little package, just pure, unadulterated slug. Again, purging would be attempted, perhaps even more diligently, followed by very thorough cooking. Boiling them might turn them into a rather unappetizing, rubbery blob. Perhaps chopping them very finely and adding them to whatever thin gruel you might have, just to stretch it, to add some substance. It's the original, it's an acquired taste, where acquired means you're teetering on the brink of starvation, and this is literally an all that's moving slowly enough for you to catch. It's interesting. One not a quirky little tidbit is that some monastic orders, particularly during periods like Lent, when meat was forbidden, were permitted to eat snails. They were often classified, rather conveniently, alongside fish or other cold-blooded creatures, not quite fitting the definition of flesh meat. So, while the starving peasant is boiling snails out of sheer necessity, a monk somewhere might be philosophically justifying his slightly more seasoned gastropod. The lines do get blurry, don't they? Then we venture into territory that, for much of medieval Europe, was even further off the menu grubs and insects. While today we hear about cricket flour and sustainable insect protein, our ancestors weren't exactly lining up for beetle larvae bars. Generally, the consumption of insects, or entomophagy, was far less common in Europe compared to many other parts of the world, like Asia, Africa, or the Americas, where insects have long been a recognized and valued food source. Why this European aversion? Historians still argue whether the widespread European aversion to insect consumption was purely cultural, perhaps tied to agricultural practices that framed insects primarily as pests, or also linked to the relative abundance, even in lean times, of other small game and forageable plants compared to some other ecosystems. It's a fascinating question. It's not to say it never happened. If you're truly at the end of your tether and you overturn a rotting log, revealing fat, pale grubs, the larvae of beetles, perhaps, the instinct for survival might just override deeply ingrained disgust. These would be protein, after all, cooked thoroughly. Of course, perhaps roasted until crispy, if you could manage it. But accounts of widespread systematic insect consumption in medieval Europe during famines are sparse. It seems to have been more of an absolute, final resort, an individual or small group making an unrecorded, desperate choice. You might find references to things like manna from trees, which sometimes turned out to be the sugary excretions of aphids or scale insects, collected more as a sweet treat than a substantial food source. Or perhaps children, with their less developed sense of yuck, might experiment, but for the most part, the European famine diet, as grim as it was with its spoiled grains and boiled nettles, like we talked about earlier, didn't routinely extend to a six-legged buffet. This isn't to cast judgment, merely to observe a cultural difference in what constitutes food when the larder is bare. The crawling things underfoot, the snails and slugs, were a more likely, if still unappetizing, port of call. It's a reminder that hunger doesn't just gnaw at your stomach, It reshapes your entire perception of the world around you, turning the slimy and the skittering into a flicker of hope, a tiny bulwark against the encroaching void. Every little bit counts when you're trying to keep body and soul together, even if that bit once had feelers and left a silvery trail. And so, as you continue to navigate this often unforgiving landscape, always on the lookout for that next meal, your attention eventually drifts downwards, past the rustling leaves, beyond the tangled roots. You spot them, the strange, often beautiful, and sometimes treacherous offerings of the fungal kingdom. We're talking mushrooms, my friend, and the complex relationship our ancestors had with these enigmatic organisms. A relationship often teetering between a fungal feast and a very sudden, very permanent famine. You can almost feel the dampness of the forest floor seeping into your worn leather shoes, the earthy, loamy scent filling your nostrils. It's autumn, perhaps, and after a good rain, they're everywhere. Little buttons pushing through the leaf litter, flamboyant shelves clinging to decaying logs, delicate parasols unfurling in the dim light. In a world where consistent calories are king, these fungi represent a tempting prospect. They're not exactly chasing you, unlike some of the other, more mobile dinner options we've discussed. No, they just sit there, silently offering themselves up, or so it seems. The reliance on wild mushrooms, you see, wasn't just some quaint hobby like your modern-day foraging influencer, armed with a wicker basket and a field guide app. For many ancient communities, especially those in forested regions or during lean times when other food sources dwindled, fungi could mean the difference between a satisfied belly and the gnawing pangs of hunger. They could be a crucial supplement, providing proteins, vitamins like B and D, and essential minerals. When the hunt failed, or the crops were meager, a successful mushroom foray could be a literal lifesaver. You can imagine the quiet hope as you'd set out, eyes scanning the familiar patches where the good ones usually grew. Your heart giving a little leap when you spotted a cluster of chanterelles, golden and fragrant, or a hefty porcini, its cap smooth and inviting. But here's where the famine part of fungal feast, or famine fungi, rears its ugly and often deadly and yaberhidi. For every delicious, nutritious mushroom, there's often a doppelganger lurking nearby, a sinister twin dressed in deceptively similar attire, just waiting to wreck your digestive system, your liver, your kidneys, and ultimately, your existence. It's like playing Russian roulette with your salad, except the revolver is a mushroom, and the bullet is a cocktail of amatoxins or phallotoxins. Delicious. The risks involved were, and still are, profoundly serious. You're not just risking a bad tummy ache. Some of the most notorious poisonous varieties, like the Amanita phalloides, chillingly known as the death cap or the destroying angel, can cause a truly horrific demise. The initial symptoms might be delayed, lulling you into a false sense of security for 6 to 24 hours. You might think you just had a rich meal. Then, the violent cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea begin. There might be a brief period of apparent recovery, a cruel trick, before the toxins inexorably destroy your liver and kidneys over several days. Pleasant, right? Imagine experiencing that without understanding the cellular biology behind it. Without access to modern medical intervention like liver transplants, it would have been perceived as a malevolent spirit, a curse, a punishment from the gods. And how did they tell them apart? Well, that's the million sesterce question. There were no neatly printed field guides with glossy photos and edibility checklists. Knowledge was passed down through generations, a fragile chain of oral tradition. This one, with the reddish cap and yellow pores, found under pine trees, is good. That one, which bruises blue too quickly and has a slightly off smell, will make the ancestors call you home early. You'd rely on the village elder, the wise woman, the experienced forager, but even they could make mistakes. Species can vary in appearance based on weather, location, or substrate. Young, unexpanded mushrooms can be particularly tricky to identify. Sometimes, a patch of perfectly edible fungi might have a poisonous interloper growing right in its midst. The original Is It Cake challenge, but with much higher liver-destroying stakes. Historians still argue whether ancient peoples developed reliable, widespread methods for distinguishing edible from poisonous fungi beyond localized, often risky, folk knowledge. Some believe that, through millennia of trial and often fatal error, communities did build up fairly robust identification skills for their local species. Others are more skeptical, pointing to the inherent dangers and the likelihood that mushrooms remained a food source approached with extreme caution, perhaps only consumed in dire circumstances or by those with specialized and still imperfect knowledge. We do know that mushrooms have been part of the human diet for a very long time. For instance, Otzi the Iceman. Remember him from our earlier chat about ancient tools? He was found carrying two types of polypore fungi, one likely for tinder and the other Piptoporus betulinus, which has known medicinal properties and can be mildly antibiotic. So, the knowledge of fungi wasn't just about food. And when it comes to the culinary appreciation, or deadly potential of mushrooms, the Romans were quite involved. They prized certain varieties, like truffles and Boletus edulis porcini, as delicacies. In fact, a rather mainstream historical fact points to the unfortunate Emperor Claudius, who, according to some accounts, was purportedly poisoned in 54 AD by his ambitious wife Agrippina, using a dish of delicious, but fatally tampered with, mushrooms. Though, to be fair, other sources suggest it was just good old-fashioned poison in his regular food. Mushrooms or not, Agrippina was thorough. If nothing else, one quirky, lesser-known tidbit about mushroom folklore involves the various tests people believed could distinguish the good from the bad. Some thought that if a mushroom peeled easily, it was edible. Others believed that if you cooked a mushroom with a silver coin and the coin tarnished, the mushroom was poisonous. Spoiler alert, these tests are utterly unreliable. Many deadly amanitas peel just fine, and silver can tarnish for various chemical reasons unrelated to toxicity. Relying on such methods would be like using a dowsing rod to find Wi-Fi. Probably not going to end well. So, fungi represented this incredible paradox, a potentially significant food source, abundant in the right conditions, packed with nutrients, yet simultaneously a lethal gamble. You can imagine the internal debate. You're hungry? Your family is hungry. There, under the oak tree, is a beautiful flush of what look like your favorite edible mushrooms. But there's that nagging doubt. Was the stem a bit too pale? Did the gills look quite right? Making the wrong call didn't just mean an upset stomach. It could decimate a family, weaken a community. This is why famine fungi is an apt term. The famine wasn't just a lack of edible mushrooms, but also the self-imposed famine born of fear. Perhaps entire seasons went by where communities, spooked by a recent poisoning incident, avoided mushrooms altogether, even the ones they knew were safe, just in case. The psychological weight of that risk must have been immense. You see something that looks like food, smells like food, but you know it could be a stealthy assassin. It's a very particular kind of stress, isn't it? A constant, low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily survival? Think about the sheer biodiversity of fungi. Tens of thousands of species, with new ones still being discovered. Only a small fraction are choice edibles. Another small fraction are deadly poisonous. and a whole lot in between are either unpalatable, mildly toxic, or simply of unknown edibility. Our ancestors were navigating this complex spectrum with senses, experience, and inherited wisdom as their only guides. No Google Lens to snap a pic and get an instant and sometimes hilariously wrong ID. No emergency rooms equipped for organ failure. Just you, the forest, and the silent, beautiful, potentially lethal mushroom. It makes you appreciate that shrink-wrapped punnet of button mushrooms from the supermarket just a little bit more, doesn't it? Even if they are a bit bland by comparison to the wild ones. But hey, at least they won't make your liver file for early retirement. So, as you tuck yourself in tonight, maybe spare a thought for those ancient foragers, weighing the odds with every mushroom they picked. Their careful dance with danger allowed them to tap into this rich, yet perilous food source, shaping their diets and, undoubtedly, their folklore and respect for the natural world's more subtle offerings and its more subtle threats. The forest floor, a place of both bounty and silent, patient peril. All right, let's settle back in. Your gaze, which has been scanning the mid-levels of the forest, perhaps looking for those berries we touched upon earlier, now drifts downwards. You're looking at the forest floor itself, a rich tapestry of fallen leaves, damp earth, twigs, and moss. It's easy to overlook what's right at your feet, but this layer, this humble carpet of the woods, holds its own kind of pantry, though it's one that often demands a bit more persuasion. Not everything here is a simple case of pick and eat. Some of the most valuable resources require significant effort, a kind of ancient culinary alchemy. You see them scattered almost everywhere, nestled amongst the decaying leaves, their smooth, sometimes glossy shells catching the dappled sunlight acorns. They come in various shapes and sizes, depending on the oak species, some with jaunty little caps still clinging on, like tiny wooden berets. You pick one up, it feels cool, solid, a satisfying weight in your palm. There's a definite promise here, a promise of fats, carbohydrates, a good source of calories that can be stored. But, like a too-good-to-be-true online offer, there's a catch, a rather significant fine print tannins. Tannins. Even the word sounds a bit drying, doesn't it? These are bitter compounds, astringent, the kind that make your mouth pucker and feel like all the moisture has been instantly wicked away. Think of that feeling when you sip a very strong, oversteeped black tea or a particularly robust red wine. Now, multiply that by a factor that makes it not just unpleasant, but largely indigestible and, in large quantities, potentially harmful to your kidneys. So, these abundant, calorie-rich nuts are locked behind a chemical defense, nature's little way of saying, you want this, you're going to have to work for it, and work they did. The primary method for dealing with these tannins is leaching, essentially washing them out. Imagine gathering basket upon basket of these acorns. The sheer quantity needed would be substantial. Then, the real labor begins. If you're fortunate, there's a clear, flowing stream nearby, one of those babbling brooks that sounds so peaceful. You might first crack the acorns, remove the shells, and then pound or grind the nut meats into a coarse meal. This meal would then be placed into a finely woven basket, or perhaps a sack made of natural fibers, or even just spread in a sandy hollow by the water's edge. The basket or sack would be submerged in the cold, moving water. The stream, ever patient, does the slow, methodical work of carrying away those bitter tannins. This isn't a quick rinse cycle like your modern washing machine. We're talking about hours, potentially even days, depending on the specific type of acorn. Some are far more bitter than others, and the temperature and flow of the water. You'd periodically check, perhaps taking a tiny nibble, still puckering. still tasting like you've licked a battery. Back into the water it goes. Patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a core ingredient in the recipe for survival. Alternatively, there's the hot water method. This involves boiling the crushed or whole-shelled acorns, sometimes through multiple changes of water. You'd bring a pot, likely an earthenware vessel, or even a tightly woven basket into which hot stones were dropped, to a boil with the acorns in it. The water would turn a dark, murky brown, the color of very, very strong tea. That's the tannins making their exit. You'd pour off that bitter brew, add fresh water, and boil again, and again, and possibly again. It's a bit like trying to wash a really stubborn coffee stain out of your favorite white t-shirt. Except the t-shirt is your dinner, and the stain is what prevents it from being dinner. You can almost smell the woody, slightly acrid scent of boiling tannins in the air, mixed with wood smoke from the fire. Why go to all this trouble? Well, it's a mainstream historical fact that for many indigenous peoples, especially across vast regions of what is now California and parts of North America and Europe, acorns weren't just a fallback food, they were a foundational staple. They were the bread, the pasta, the rice of their diet, providing a reliable and storable source of calories that could see communities through lean winter months. The sheer abundance of oak trees in many regions made this effort worthwhile. Now for a quirky little tidbit. Some cultures developed ingenious ways to streamline or enhance the leaching process. For instance, certain Native American groups in California would dig shallow basins in sand near a river. They'd line these with leaves, pour in the acorn meal, and then gently pour water over it repeatedly, letting it percolate through the sand, which acted as a filter and helped draw out the tannins. Others, as we mentioned with fermenting, had different tricks. There's even evidence of specialized, almost ritualistic, tools and locations dedicated to acorn processing, showing how central it was to their way of life. It wasn't just a chore, it was a crucial community activity. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption and intensification of acorn processing, which is incredibly labor-intensive, represented a positive step towards greater food security and culinary sophistication, allowing for larger, more settled populations, or if it was more of a necessary adaptation, a response to declining availability of easier-to-hunt large game or more readily available plant foods. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a complex interplay of environmental pressures and human ingenuity. Think about it in modern terms. We consider it a bit of a hassle if we have to, say, soak beans overnight before cooking them. Our ancestors, or at least people living in similar environments, were undertaking multi-day chemical engineering projects just to make a handful of nuts edible. We pop a pre-washed salad from a bag, or a microwave meal that's ready in 3 minutes. They were engaged in a profound, hands-on dialogue with their environment, understanding its gifts and its challenges on an incredibly intimate level. You probably wouldn't find too many ancient foragers complaining about artisanal, hand-leached acorn meal being too much effort. It was simply what you did. I doubt they had Yelp reviews for the best leaching spots. 5 stars, great current, tannins removed in record time. And acorns weren't the only things on the forest floor demanding such respect and effort. Many wild roots and tubers, while potentially rich in starches, might be fibrous, hard to digest, or contain mildly toxic compounds that required prolonged boiling, roasting in ashes, or sometimes even grating, and soaking. Much like cassava is processed in other parts of the world to remove cyanide, certain nuts, beyond acorns, might have incredibly tough shells requiring dedicated nutting stones to crack, or bitter skins that needed to be laboriously removed, or also leached. It's a reminder that the wild supermarket often had a pretty intensive checkout process. So, after all that crushing, pounding, boiling, or soaking. What did you get? You'd have a bland but nutritious meal. This acorn flour or paste could then be cooked into a sort of porridge or mush, often a staple, or baked into dense, flat breads on hot stones. It wouldn't taste like your morning muffin, that's for sure. It would be earthy, sustaining, perhaps subtly nutty if you were lucky, and the leaching was perfect. It's the kind of food that speaks less of gourmet delight and more of deep, practical nourishment, the taste of survival itself, earned through knowledge, patience, and a whole lot of elbow grease. It really makes you appreciate that bag of pre-shelled, roasted almonds you can just grab from the cupboard, doesn't it? Our ancestors probably would have thought that was some kind of unbelievable magic. Right then, your gaze drifts, as it so often does, towards where the days, or perhaps the weeks, bread supply is kept. It's the cornerstone, isn't it? That one thing, that simple baked necessity that, in better times, you barely even thought about. Now, it's an obsession, a focal point around which your meager existence revolves. Remember that almost fantastical image of overflowing granaries we touched upon, those golden waves of grain? Well, you can gently pack that away in your mental scrapbook of things that are not happening right now. You see, the fields, if they were even sown, haven't been kind, or perhaps the sowers were otherwise occupied. So, the grain that does make it to the mill, or more likely, to your own worn-down handquern, is a motley crew. Forget your fine, sifted wheat, the kind that makes those light, fluffy loaves you've only heard about in stories from much, much older folk, or perhaps dreamt of after a particularly unfulfilling meal. What you're dealing with now is, well, it's grain-ish. There might be a bit of hearty rye, some tough barley, maybe even oats, which, let's be honest, most self-respecting bread of a previous era would have turned its nose up at. But beggars, as they say, can't be choosers, and your stomach is definitely begging. The first compromise, the one you've almost come to expect, is the bran. Oh, bran. You know, that stuff modern health gurus will tell you to sprinkle on your organic yogurt for an extra fiber kick. Back then, for a decent loaf, it was meticulously sifted out, considered coarse, common. Now, it's a valued friend, a bulking agent, the miller. If there even is a communal miller left who hasn't scarpered, isn't bothering with such niceties as sifting, you get the whole grain, and then some. The resulting flour is darker, rougher, and the bread it produces has a certain chewiness, a robust character, you might generously call it. But bran is practically a luxury when things get tighter. That's when you start seeing the chaff making a regular appearance. Chaff, the very husks, the inedible outer layers of the grain, the bits that are usually swept away, fodder for the fire or, if you're lucky, for animals even less discerning than you're becoming. Ground down, or perhaps just mixed in, it adds a certain grittiness to the loaf. Each bite is a little adventure for your teeth. You try to tell yourself it's just extra texture. You're not entirely convincing. Your jaw gets a good workout, though, so there's that. Silver linings, right. And when the grain supply, even generously padded with its own discarded packaging, dwindles to a worrying low, your eyes, and the eyes of everyone around you, start to wander. You look towards those sacks in the corner, the ones holding the dried pulses, peas, beans, lentils, legumes. Not exactly what springs to mind when you think bread, is it? But ground down laboriously into a coarse, often stubbornly lumpy flour, they can be incorporated. The dough is different. It's often stickier, or perhaps more crumbly. depending on the pulse. It rarely rises well, leading to dense, rather flat loaves that could, in a pinch, probably serve as a useful paperweight if paper was something you had in abundance, or indeed had any use for the taste. Earthy. Very, very earthy. Sometimes with a slightly bitter aftertaste that lingers, a constant reminder of the day's compromises. You learn to appreciate the sheer caloric density, if not the culinary experience. Now, this is where things take a turn from making do to sheer unadulterated desperation. This is the bread that truly earns its name, the bread of desperation, because when the grains are a distant memory and the pulses are being rationed like precious jewels, ingenuity, or perhaps a kind of quiet, grinding madness, takes over. People start to look at the landscape with new eyes. What else can be ground? You might see someone painstakingly gathering acorns, leaching them of their bitterness, drying them, and then attempting to pound them into something resembling flour. The resulting bread is dark, almost black, and carries a strong tannic flavor that's an acquired taste, to put it mildly. Historians still argue whether the widespread incorporation of things like ground chestnuts or even certain types of powdered root vegetables was a sign of resilient local adaptation or an indicator of a community truly on the brink of collapse. It's a fine line, isn't it, between resourcefulness and just eating dirt, essentially. And speaking of dirt, there are hushed tales, whispers you try to ignore, of even less savory additions, sawdust, from non-poisonous trees. Of course, one hopes they check. Finely ground. It adds bulk, but absolutely zero nutrition. It's the ultimate culinary deception, tricking your stomach into feeling full for a fleeting moment before the gnawing emptiness returns, perhaps even angrier than before. There are even accounts, in some truly dire straits, of fine clay or chalk being mixed into the flour to give it weight and substance. Imagine that, biting into a loaf that's part earth. It's a sobering thought, a stark contrast to the almost religious reverence bread usually holds. One of the more pervasive dangers with relying on whatever grain you can find, especially rye, is the ever-present threat of ergot. That's a nasty little fungus, a dark spur that can grow on rye in damp conditions. If it gets ground in with the grain, it can cause ergotism, a truly horrific condition. Back then, they called it St. Anthony's fire. And it could lead to excruciating burning sensations in the limbs, gangrene, convulsions, and terrifying hallucinations. So, every time you look at a dark, unappetizing loaf made with suspect rye, there's that little flicker of extra fear, as if starvation wasn't enough to contend with. Now your bread might literally drive you mad or make your limbs fall off. It's like a terrible lottery, isn't it? Today's special plain suffering, or suffering with a side of psychedelic horror, on a slightly less terrifying, more quirky note, in some coastal communities, when desperation truly knocked, they'd turn to the sea. There are accounts of people harvesting certain types of seaweed, drying it thoroughly, and then grinding it into a powder to mix with whatever other extenders they had. You can just imagine the flavor profile of that loaf, salty, a bit briny, with a vague, lingering hint of the ocean. Probably not going to win any baking awards. But again, calories are calories. And who knows, maybe the iodine was good for them. Every cloud, the process of making this bread is a testament to endurance. You're not just kneading dough, you're wrestling with it. The lack of gluten in many of these extenders means it doesn't behave like proper dough. It's often a stiff, unyielding paste, or a wet, sticky mess. Baking, too, is a challenge. These loaves don't often get a good oven spring. If they spring at all, they bake into dense, heavy pucks. The crust might be rock hard, the inside stubbornly damp and doughy. The aroma, Well, sometimes it smells faintly of what it's made from. A bit beany, a bit nutty, a bit of the forest floor. Other times, it just smells faintly of smoke and disappointment. You slice into it, if slice is even the right word. Sometimes it's more like hacking or sawing. The texture is, inevitably, coarse. You can feel the bits of bran, the unground pieces of chaff, the gritty particles of, well, you try not to think too hard about what the gritty particles are. Each mouthful is a conscious effort, a chore rather than a pleasure. It fills a space, yes, but it rarely satisfies. It's a constant, tangible reminder of how far things have fallen. A far cry from those delicate, enriched manchet breads we might have fleetingly discussed. The kind reserved for the highest tables. This is the bread of the common struggle. The bread that tastes of survival itself. Bitter, hard-won, and utterly essential. You chew, you swallow, and you hope tomorrow might bring something, anything, better, but you don't count on it. All right. So after navigating those tricky medieval markets, where every purchase felt like a gamble, you find your way back to the heart of the medieval household, or perhaps, more accurately, to its bubbling, gurgling, and occasionally alarming underbelly. We're talking about the places where food isn't just cooked, but transformed. Tonight, we're diving nose first into the world of fermented and funky flavors. You're stepping into a space where the air itself is alive, thick with the scent of yeast, sharp vinegar, and something, well, something earthy and a little bit wild. You see, without our modern refrigerators humming away, or the convenience of shrink-wrapped everything, making food last was a constant, pressing concern. And sometimes, the only way to deal with less than perfect ingredients, or things you wouldn't dream of eating fresh, was to let nature, with a bit of guidance, work its strange magic. This wasn't just about avoiding starvation. It was about unlocking new tastes, new textures, and, quite frankly, making the inedible edible, or at least less immediately regrettable. Imagine you're peering into a cool, dim cellar or a dedicated pantry space. Stone walls, perhaps a dirt floor. Your eyes adjust, and you see them rows of earthenware crocks, wooden barrels, and perhaps even some stretched animal bladders, all doing their mysterious work. Listen closely. You can almost hear the soft fizz and pop of the quiet conversations of microbial life. This is where the real alchemy happens, turning bland staples or questionable scraps into something with character. Sometimes, a lot of character. Enough character to clear out your sinuses and maybe the next village over. Let's start with the vegetables. You see a large crock, and as you get closer, a familiar sour tang hits you. Cabbage, shredded and pounded with salt, is slowly becoming sauerkraut, or its many medieval cousins. The salt draws out the water, creating a brine, and then the lactobacilli, those microscopic superheroes, get to work, converting sugars into lactic acid. This acid not only preserves the cabbage, but also gives it that delightful zing. You might see turnips, carrots, even beets, submerged in their own salty baths, slowly pickling, their colors deepening, their flavors intensifying. This isn't your grandma's neat vinegar-pickled cucumbers. This is wilder, more robust. It's a method that's been around for millennia, a testament to its simple effectiveness. One mainstream historical fact for you: the Romans were absolutely mad for fermented cabbage, a practice that undoubtedly traveled with their legions and influenced food preservation across Europe. Now, your gaze drifts to another corner, where milk, that precious but highly perishable commodity, is undergoing its own metamorphosis. Remember how we talked about the challenges of keeping dairy fresh? Well, here's one solution. You see tubs where milk, left to its own devices in a hopefully cleanish environment, has clabbered, thickened by natural bacteria into a yogurt-like substance. And then there's cheese. Oh, the glorious accidental miracle of cheese. Perhaps it started with milk stored in an animal stomach pouch. The rennet naturally present curdling the milk. From soft, fresh cheeses eaten within days, to harder aged varieties that could last for months, cheese was a vital source of protein and fat. You can almost smell the pungent aroma of a ripening cheese, a smell that ranges from mildly nutty to, well, let's just say, assertive. Historians still argue whether the development of specific cheese types was purely accidental discovery or a result of deliberate, albeit rudimentary, experimentation with different milks, temperatures, and aging conditions. And what about drinks water? As we've discussed, could be a risky proposition. So, what do? You ferment ale and beer were staples, brewed in homes and monasteries alike. You see wooden tuns, bubbling gently as yeast consumes the sugars in malted barley, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. This wasn't the high-octane craft beer you might be thinking of. Much of it was small beer, low in alcohol, consumed by everyone, including children, as a safer alternative to water and a source of calories. Monasteries, in fact, became renowned centers of brewing, meticulously refining techniques and recipes, a tradition that echoes in many abbey ales still brewed today. Then there's mead, that ancient honey wine, its sweetness varying depending on the honey and the length of fermentation. If you're in a wine-producing region, you'd see grape juice undergoing a similar transformation, its sugars turning into the warming comfort of wine. The air here is distinctly yeasty, a smell that's almost bready. But fermentation wasn't just for vegetables and drinks. It was also applied, sometimes daringly, to meat and fish, especially the less desirable bits. While salting and smoking were the primary methods for preserving flesh, fermentation could play a supporting role, or sometimes an accidental one that needed managing. Think about fish sauces, like the ancient Roman garum, which had medieval descendants. These were made by layering fish and salt and letting them decompose and ferment over months, resulting in a potent, umami-rich liquid. It sounds intense, and it absolutely was. But it added incredible depth of flavor to otherwise bland dishes. You can imagine the smell alone would be an experience. One quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the practice in some northern cultures of fermenting fish by burying it, like the Icelandic hakarl fermented shark, which, while perhaps a bit extreme for our medieval focus here, illustrates the lengths people would go to preserve and transform. The line between preserved and, oh dear, that's gone very, very wrong, was a fine one. And without a modern understanding of harmful bacteria, it was a gamble every time. They didn't have a name for botulism, but they certainly knew when a batch had turned deadly. This brings us to the undesirable food items. Imagine foraged wild greens that are too bitter to eat raw, or roots that might contain mild toxins, through processes like leaching in running water, followed by fermentation. These could be rendered not only safe, but also surprisingly palatable. Think about acorns, a plentiful botanic food source, which required extensive processing, grinding, leaching, and sometimes a fermentation step to become a usable flour. Or consider offal, the internal organs of an animal, while some, like liver, might be prized. Other bits could be transformed through pickling or being incorporated into heavily spiced, fermented sausages, their strong flavors mellowed and preserved by the process. It was about resourcefulness, about wringing every last bit of sustenance from the environment. This whole system was basically an accidental foray into probiotics. They weren't cultivating gut health knowingly, but their diet, rich in these living foods, was probably doing them a world of good when it wasn't trying to kill them with a bad batch. Of course, that's a medieval wellness trend I'm not sure I'd sign up for. You take a slow breath, trying to sort through the complex symphony of smells. It's a far cry from the sanitized aisles of a modern supermarket. There's a funkiness, yes, but it's the funk of life, of transformation. It's sour, it's tangy, it's earthy, and sometimes it's just plain pungent. But beneath it all, there's a sense of ingenuity, of humans working with nature, coaxing it, sometimes wrestling with it, to make food last, to make it interesting, and to make every morsel count in a world where a failed harvest or a harsh winter could mean the difference between life and death. These weren't just preservation techniques, they were culinary traditions in the making, laying the groundwork for many of the fermented foods we still cherish, or wrinkle our noses at, today. And so, with the choicest cuts carefully preserved, and the hide perhaps already stretched and beginning its journey to usefulness, like we talked about with those meticulous scraping techniques, you turn your attention to what many today would simply discard: the bones. Yes, those stark, unyielding frameworks that carried the very creature you now rely on for survival. You can't just toss them onto the midden heap. Not yet. There's still treasure locked within, a final whispered promise of nourishment. This is where you truly embrace the art of extracting the last drop of nutrition. You gather the larger bones, the femurs, the tibias, those sturdy remnants, your hands, already so familiar with the textures of sinew and flesh, now heft their surprising weight. The first step, often, is to make them more approachable. You might use a heavy stone, one you've selected for its good heft and flat striking surface, much like the one you used for cracking nuts. Remember that careful precision. With a few well-aimed blows, you crack them open, not to shatter them into dust, but to expose the honeycomb structure within, to invite the heat and water to do their work more intimately. It's not about brute force, though some is required. It's about understanding the material, knowing where to strike. You're not exactly performing surgery, but it's a far cry from just chucking them in a pot like a forgotten hockey puck. Then, into your cooking vessel. They go. Perhaps it's that clay pot you so painstakingly formed and fired, the one that still smells faintly of wood smoke and a dozen previous meals, or maybe even a sturdy animal hide stomach, suspended carefully over the embers. You add water, precious water you might have hauled from a stream some distance away, and then you wait. This isn't a rapid boil, a frantic rush. This is a slow, patient simmer. You tend the fire, keeping it low and steady, coaxing the heat to gently persuade the bones to release their secrets. Hours pass. The air around your camp, already rich with the scent of wood smoke and perhaps the lingering aroma of roasted meat from earlier, now begins to carry a new note, a subtle, deeply savory perfume. It's the smell of bone broth beginning to form. You watch as tiny bubbles rise to the surface, bringing with them shimmering globules of fat, little golden eyes winking in the firelight. This liquid, slowly thickening, slowly becoming more opaque, is liquid gold in a world where every calorie, every nutrient is a victory. This isn't your fancy artisanal bone broth from the trendy cafe down the street. Mind you, the one that costs more than your entire week's coffee budget. No, this is the real deal, born of necessity, brewed with patience. This broth you're creating is rich in collagen, which, while not a complete protein, is vital for your connective tissues, your skin, your joints. Think of it as internal maintenance. It's also pulling out minerals, calcium, phosphorus, things your body craves, especially if your diet is otherwise limited. It's warm, it's comforting, And even if it's not a feast in itself, it's a deeply satisfying supplement. The mainstream historical fact here is that the practice of boiling bones for sustenance is ancient, with evidence found at Neanderthal sites, suggesting our very distant ancestors understood this fundamental principle of using everything. They weren't just gnawing on bones, they were stewing them down, a testament to their resourcefulness. But the bones have another treasure to yield, perhaps even more prized than the broth, the marrow. Deep within the cavities of the long bones lies this rich, fatty substance. You might have already cracked some bones specifically for this before the long boil, or you might retrieve them now, still warm from the pot, with a smaller, more pointed tool, perhaps a sliver of sharpened bone from a previous animal, or a specially shaped stone. You carefully scoop it out. It's soft, almost like a very firm butter, and incredibly energy dense. This is pure fuel. In a world of lean game and uncertain harvests, marrow is a caloric jackpot. The taste is unique, rich, umami, with a primal quality that speaks directly to your body's deepest needs. You might eat it straight, spread it on a piece of dried meat if you have it, or even mix it into the broth to enrich it further. It's a moment of quiet indulgence, a reward for your patience and effort. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit for you is that some archaeological finds include what appear to be specialized marrow extractors, suggesting that this wasn't just a random scooping, but a developed technique, with tools perhaps even passed down or treasured for their effectiveness in getting every last smear. Imagine a prehistoric toolkit with a dedicated marrow spatula. Efficiency experts, even then. This whole process, this dedication to extracting every last vestige of nourishment, highlights a profound respect for the animal and a keen understanding of survival. Nothing is wasted, even the smaller bones. The ones not worth the effort of cracking for marrow contribute their essence to the communal pot. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for extensive bone processing was always nutritional stress, a desperate measure in lean times, or if, in some cultures and periods of plenty, it also evolved into a culinary preference, or even held ritualistic significance, where sharing marrow was a specific social act. It's likely a complex mix, but the underlying principle of maximizing resources remains. You consider the stark contrast with how easily we discard things today. A chicken carcass, after a Sunday roast, straight into the bin for many, barely a second thought. But here, in this past you're inhabiting, every knuckle, every rib, every vertebra is assessed for its potential. It's a mindset that's hard to fully grasp when you can just pop to the shops for a prepackaged meal, isn't it? It makes you wonder if we've lost something, some fundamental connection to the sources of our sustenance, even if our ancestors were occasionally just hoping their stone soup actually had some flavor this time around. The broth, once simmered for long enough, is strained if you have the means, or simply ladled carefully, leaving the depleted bones behind. These bones, now pale and light, have given their all. They might still find a use, perhaps as tools or ornaments, a topic for another time, but their nutritional journey is complete. You sip the warm liquid, feeling its goodness spread through you, a subtle warmth that's more than just temperature. It's the satisfaction of knowing you've honored the life that was taken, and in doing so, you've given yourself a better chance to see another sunrise. It's the quiet triumph of the last drop. So, you drift further into this shadowed landscape of human endurance, and remember how we touched upon the ingenious, sometimes heartbreaking, ways people adapted when the pantries, as it were, ran completely bare. Now, we're peeling back another layer, looking at the very specific, documented delicacies that entire communities, entire villages, might find themselves relying on. not for a day or a week, but for agonizingly long stretches. You begin to understand the true meaning of making do when the only things left are what nature, in its most ungenerous mood, provides, or what human desperation can reclassify as edible. Imagine, if you will, the green fields of Ireland in the mid-19th century, a beautiful, tragic land, and as the potato, their staple, their everything, turns to black, stinking mush in the ground. A mainstream historical fact, of course, is that the blight, Phytophthora infestans, swept through the crops with horrifying speed. You see entire villages slowly, inexorably, starving. So, what's on the menu? You might find yourself, along with your neighbors, foraging for nettles. Yes, stinging nettles, boiled. They lose their sting, becoming a sort of bland, stringy spinach. You'd gather seaweed too, especially types like dulls or carrigan moss. You'd boil them into a kind of jelly, or dry them to chew on. Not exactly your artisanal, hand-harvested nori, is it? The tang of the sea, the slight grittiness, would be a constant reminder of your precarious existence. Then there's charlock, or wild mustard, a common weed. Its seeds, when ground, could be mixed with a little water, if you had it, to form a kind of bitter, unappetizing paste. You'd see children, their bellies swollen, not from fullness, but from malnutrition, diligently picking these seeds. One quirky, lesser-known tidbit from this era is the suspicion surrounding Peel's brimstone, the yellow cornmeal imported from America. Some communities, unfamiliar with its color or proper preparation, believed it was poisonous or intended to harm them. A tragic misunderstanding when actual sustenance was so close. And the desperate ingenuity didn't stop there. People ate sorrel, dock leaves, even grass, sometimes boiled into a grim, watery soup. Historians still argue whether the meager nutritional content of foods like boiled grass and certain seaweeds truly sustained life for extended periods, or merely staved off the most immediate gnawing pangs of hunger, a sort of green, desperate placebo against the inevitable. You can almost feel the damp chill, the constant gnawing emptiness, the shared silence of a village trying to survive on what the earth grudgingly offered up from its leftover scraps. Now, let your thoughts drift across continents and time to the harrowing siege of Leningrad during World War II. Here, it's not a rural blight, but an urban stranglehold. For almost 900 days, the city was cut off. What do you eat when the shops are empty, the supply lines severed? You become an unwilling expert in extreme recycling. You might find yourself looking at your leather belt, your briefcase, or even the bindings of books, not for their intended purpose, but as a potential source of something. People would boil leather for hours, hoping to extract some gelatinous substance, a faint, ghostly memory of protein. Imagine the smell in those cramped, freezing apartments, the acrid scent of slowly simmering hide. Bread, that most basic comfort, became a cruel joke. The infamous Leningrad siege bread often contained more sawdust, cellulose, or even wallpaper paste than actual flour. You'd queue for hours in the bitter cold for a tiny, dense, dark ration that tasted of wood and despair. The texture alone would be a trial, gritty, tough, something your teeth would struggle with. A rather grim mainstream fact is that daily rations eventually fell to as little as 125 grams of this bread for manual workers, and even less for others. And for a quirky, lesser-known tidbit, some resourceful, or perhaps deeply delusional, citizens kept meticulous diaries detailing the supposed caloric content of things like carpentry glue or library paste, which they'd scrape from walls or books. Historians still argue whether these calculations represented a genuine, albeit minuscule energy source, or were a psychological coping mechanism, a way to impose order on an utterly chaotic and horrifying reality. You'd share these meals new with your family. The silence punctuated only by the gnawing of your own stomach and the distant rumble of artillery. Maybe someone would even try to make a joke about the new bread recipe. Something about it having more fiber than a lumberjack's breakfast, but the laughter would catch in their throat. Let's travel once more, this time to China during the Great Famine of the late 1950s and early 60s. Here, the scale is almost unimaginable. Entire provinces faced starvation. And what did the earth offer sometimes? Quite literally, itself. You might hear whispers of Guanyin Tu, or Goddess of Mercy Clay. People, desperate beyond measure, would dig up this fine white clay and eat it. It filled the stomach, creating a temporary, deceptive sense of fullness, but offered no nutrition. In fact, it often led to severe constipation and internal blockages. You can picture a village, the fields barren, the granaries empty, and people, gaunt and slow-moving, turning to the very soil beneath their feet. Tree bark became a common sight on the table. You'd strip the soft inner bark from elms or poplars, boil it, grind it, try to make it into something, anything that could pass for food. It's tough, astringent, and your digestive system would protest violently. Wild grasses, chaff, corn cobs after the kernels were gone, cotton husks. Nothing was overlooked. The ingenuity was born of sheer, unadulterated need. It's a sobering thought that for millions, the daily grind wasn't just a turn of phrase. It was the literal act of grinding inedible materials in a desperate attempt to cheat death. This wasn't some niche survivalist hack. It was the reality for vast swathes of the population. A mainstream historical fact is the devastating human cost of this famine, with estimates of excess deaths ranging in the tens of millions. One quirky, if profoundly sad, detail is the emergence of recipes for things like algae skimmed from ponds, or specific methods for preparing tree leaves to make them slightly less unpalatable. And, of course, historians still argue whether the primary cause of the famine was natural disaster or catastrophic policy decisions, a debate that echoes the complexities we see in many such crises. The collective memory of these times, of these foods, is seared into the cultural consciousness, a haunting reminder of how thin the veneer of abundance can be. You can almost taste the bitterness, the earthiness, the sheer, unyielding struggle in every imagined mouthful. It really makes you appreciate that slightly too stale loaf of bread at the back of your cupboard, doesn't it? All right, so after the grand hunts we've talked about, the feasting on venison, the careful selection of game birds, well, sometimes the larder isn't just bare, it's echoing. It's got tumbleweeds rolling through it. This is when you find yourself looking at the world with entirely new eyes, a new kind of hunger, and the definition of dinner gets flexible. You're entering the realm of hunting the marginal creatures, the small scurrying things that usually get a shoe or a trap, not a recipe book. You're not thinking about noble stags now. Are you? No. Your gaze drops lower, to the rustling in the hedgerows, the flicker of movement in the thatch, the almost invisible trails through the depleted fields. We're talking about what might be politely termed subsistence protein, or, less politely, vermin. But when hunger gnaws, those distinctions melt away like frost in the sun. Imagine you're out there, the chill of a lean season seeping into your bones, much like the damp we discussed when talking about preserving those precious grains. Your stomach feels like an empty sack, and then you see it a hedgehog, snuffling along, looking for its own meager meal of slugs and beetles. In better times, it's a quaint garden visitor, maybe even a creature of folklore. Now it's a potential roast, The traditional way to prepare these spiky little morsels, particularly favored by traveling folk, was to encase the entire hedgehog in thick clay, spines and all, and bake it directly in the embers of a fire. When the clay was cracked open, the spines and skin would supposedly come away with it, leaving the cooked meat inside. You can almost smell that earthy, slightly gamey aroma mixing with the wood smoke, a scent of pure survival. It's not exactly a five-star meal, perhaps a bit gritty, but it's calories. It's something. Then there are squirrels, quick, twitchy, and surprisingly difficult to catch without a good dog or a well-aimed stone, or perhaps a cunningly placed snare. Remember the elaborate traps we saw for larger game scale that down? Way down. A simple loop of wire, a bent sapling. Squirrels, especially the gray ones we're so familiar with, though they're an import to some regions, outcompeting the native reds, can actually provide a decent bit of meat. Think of them as tree chicken. Many rural communities, even outside of truly desperate times, considered squirrel a perfectly normal part of their diet. Stewed, fried, put into pies, a versatile little critter. There's a persistent image of pioneers and backwoodsmen relying on squirrel, and it's not entirely inaccurate. You might even find yourself chuckling at the sheer audacity of trying to skin such a small, adroit, agile creature, your fingers fumbling. But the reward, however small, keeps you focused. And now we venture into territory that might make your modern sensibilities squirm a little. Field mice. Yes, those tiny things that dart across barn floors during extreme famines. And there were many, like the Great Famine in Ireland. People ate whatever they could find. It's a grim historical fact that during sieges, such as the infamous Siege of Paris in 1870-71, the starving populace consumed not only cats and dogs, but also rats, with rats even being listed on menus in fancy restaurants, albeit at exorbitant prices. So, field mice, relatively cleaner than their urban cousins, would have been fair game, roasted on a stick over a tiny flame? Perhaps. The thought might be unappetizing now, curled up as you are, hopefully warm and well-fed, but your ancestors might have thanked their lucky stars for such a find. It's a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization can be when true hunger sets in. You might set tiny, almost doll-sized snares, or use small deadfall traps, or, if you're quick and a bit lucky, a swift grab. Every calorie counts. The effort involved for such a small return tells you everything about the desperation. You're not just hunting, you're scraping the bottom of nature's barrel. This isn't about sport or status. It's about making it to the next sunrise. It's interesting how perception shifts. An animal considered a pest, a carrier of disease, or simply insignificant suddenly becomes a lifeline. One quirky tidbit is the sheer variety of small creatures that have ended up on the menu in different cultures during hard times. Dormice were once considered a delicacy by the Romans, fattened up in special enclosures. So, while field mice might seem extreme, it's part of a broader human history of adaptable eating. Perhaps your great-great-great-grandparent, facing a harsh winter, developed a particular knack for catching them, a skill passed down not in stories, but in the quiet, desperate actions that kept the family alive. The act of preparing these tiny creatures would be an exercise in meticulous, almost meditative patience. Trying to get any usable meat from a field mouse, for example, you'd need nimble fingers, a sharp sliver of flint or metal, and an almost zen-like focus. There's no room for waste. Every sinew, every speck of flesh is precious. You can imagine the scene huddled around a meager fire, the wind whistling outside. The only sound the crackle of the flames and the quiet, intense work of preparing a meal that would barely count as an appetizer today. Historians still argue whether the consistent hunting of such marginalia, these tiny mouthfuls, truly made a significant difference in staving off widespread starvation during major famines, or if it was more a testament to human resilience and the desperate will to survive. A small supplement that offered more psychological comfort than substantial caloric intake. Could a diet of hedgehogs and field mice sustain a community? Probably not in the long run, but for an individual, for a family, for a few more days. Perhaps it's the difference between giving up and fighting on, one tiny, spiky, or fast-moving morsel at a time. You can almost feel the gritty texture, the slightly wild taste, a far cry from the rich feasts we pictured earlier, but in its own way, just as vital to the human story. You're not just tasting food, you're tasting desperation, ingenuity, and the unyielding instinct to simply keep going. And who knows, maybe that squirrel stew, seasoned with wild herbs found nearby, wasn't half bad. You'd certainly tell yourself it was the best you'd ever tasted. So, you've gathered your meager ingredients, perhaps after hours of toil, like we've walked through. Now, you actually have to taste this culinary adventure. Let's not beat around the bush. Your modern palate, accustomed to a symphony of global spices and carefully engineered flavor profiles, might find medieval survival fare, well, a little underwhelming. Imagine taking a bite of that pottage we discussed, the one simmering over your smoky fire. The first sensation is warmth, a welcome feeling, especially if the air is damp and chilly. But then comes the taste. It's predominantly earthy, very, very earthy. If you manage to find some wild garlic or onions, there's a faint, sharp burst, a welcome distraction from the dominant flavor of boiled grains and slightly bitter greens. Remember those nettles you so carefully blanched? They lend a spinach-like, almost metallic tang, if they haven't been overcooked into oblivion. The texture of this pottage is probably thick, almost porridge-like if you've used enough barley or oats. It's a texture designed to fill you, to stick to your ribs, not necessarily to delight your tongue. You might encounter the occasional lump, an uncooperative piece of turnip perhaps, offering a slightly different, more solid resistance against your teeth before yielding with a soft squish. There's a certain integrity to it, a lack of refinement that speaks volumes about its purpose. This isn't about delicate mouthfeel, it's about sustenance. And the bread. Oh, the bread. If you're fortunate, it's a dark, dense rye or barley loaf. The crust, baked perhaps on a hot stone near the fire, is thick, chewy, almost leathery. You really have to work at it. The inside, the crumb, is tight, not airy and light like your modern sourdough. As you chew, you might detect a subtle sourness from the starter, if it was a good batch, and the nutty, wholesome taste of the whole grain. But let's be honest, you might also detect grit. Remember that hand-milled flour from the quernstone? Tiny stone particles inevitably made their way into the flour. So, there's this unexpected, slightly disconcerting crunch every now and then. It's not a crouton. My friend, it's just medieval seasoning. You get used to it, or your teeth wear down. One of the two. The smell accompanying these meals is a complex tapestry. Dominating everything is the scent of wood smoke, clinging to your clothes, your hair, the food itself. It's not the pleasant, curated smokiness of a high-end barbecue. It's more acrid, pervasive. Underneath that, there's the smell of the pottage itself, that earthy, vegetative aroma. Perhaps a little soured if it's been kept for a day or two. There wasn't exactly Tupperware back then, so freshness was a fleeting concept. If meat was involved, a rare treat for many, its smell would depend heavily on its age and preparation. Gamey, strong, perhaps a little too ripe if the hunt was a few days prior and preservation methods were basic. You'd become an expert at sniffing out what was merely high versus what was truly off. Your nose becomes a primary defense mechanism. A mainstream historical fact here is that salt was incredibly valuable, not just for flavor, but as a crucial preservative. Cockles. Without it, food spoiled rapidly, making every meal a bit of a gamble. Now, let's consider the sheer effort. You've already foraged or farmed, hunted or fished. You've ground the grain, fetched the water which itself might taste of iron or minerals from the well, coaxed a fire to life with stubborn wood. Every single step is labor-intensive. Imagine kneading that dense dough for the bread, your shoulders aching, your hands raw, or stirring the pottage for what feels like an eternity to prevent it from sticking and burning in your single, precious cooking pot. There are no whisks, no food processors, no temperature-controlled ovens. Your tools are your hands, a knife, a pot, and fire. This isn't just cooking. It's a daily relentless battle against entropy and hunger. You're not whipping up a quick snack. You're wresting sustenance from a reluctant earth. The sensory experience, therefore, is intrinsically linked to this effort. That blandness, that coarseness, that slightly off smell. It's all part of a package deal where the primary reward isn't gastronomic delight, but the simple, profound relief of a filled belly. You might appreciate the subtle sweetness of a wild berry you managed to find, not because it's a gourmet treat, but because it's a tiny spark of pleasure in a world of toil. It's like finding a 50-pence piece in an old coat pocket today, a small unexpected joy. Except their 50-pence piece might mean not feeling quite so faint tomorrow. Here's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit for use in meals, especially for the slightly better off, involved sops, which were pieces of bread dipped into wine, ale, or the juices from cooked meat. For the very poor, those sops might just be bread dipped in water or weak broth. It added moisture and made stale bread more palatable. And, of course, there were trenchers, those plates made of stale bread we touched upon earlier. You'd eat your meal off it, the bread soaking up all the juices, and then, depending on your status and hunger, you'd either eat the trencher itself or give it to the dogs or the truly destitute. Talk about zero waste. Historians still argue whether the perceived blandness of the peasant diet was truly how it was experienced, or if, lacking the constant sensory bombardment of modern foods, people then had a heightened appreciation for simpler, more natural flavors. Perhaps that earthy pottage, after a long day of backbreaking labor, tasted like heaven, or perhaps it just tasted like not starving. The reality of survival meant that food was, first and foremost, fuel. Every mouthful, no matter how rough or unexciting by our standards, was a victory against the gnawing emptiness that was a constant companion for so many. The taste of slightly burnt grain, the texture of tough, boiled roots, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. These are the flavors and scents of staying alive, one hard-won meal at a time. It's a far cry from debating whether your artisanal coffee has notes of caramel or elderflower, isn't it? The biggest debate then was probably whether the squirrel you caught was big enough for two. And so, you see, the echoes from necessity's kitchen, those shadowed, often smoky spaces we've wandered through together, don't just fade into the silence of history. They resonate, often surprisingly loudly, in the world around you today. The long-term impact of these survival practices, hammered out on the anvil of hunger, is woven into the very fabric of our food cultures, our habits, and perhaps even our collective subconscious. You feel it, don't you? That slight tug of recognition when you hear about peasant cuisine being celebrated in some high-end restaurant, that rustic loaf of dark bread, the hearty stew bubbling with humble vegetables, and a forgotten cut of meat. These are the direct descendants of meals made with hope and desperation in equal measure. Remember when we talked about the art of stretching a single precious piece of bacon to flavor a week's worth of pottage, that resourcefulness, that profound respect for every edible scrap, didn't simply evaporate when harvests improved or trade routes reopened. It became ingrained, a kind of culinary muscle memory. Think about the preserving techniques we've explored: the patient salting, the careful smoking, the tangy magic of fermentation. These weren't invented for artisanal flair or a weekend hobby. They were critical technologies, the difference between a winter of slow starvation and one of meager sustenance. The mainstream historical fact is that many of these ancient preservation methods, like salting fish or curing meats, became so foundational that they formed the basis of regional culinary identities long after the immediate, desperate need for them subsided. Your modern charcuterie board, with its delightful variety of cured meats, owes a significant debt to ancestors who meticulously salted and air-dried proteins. Like we saw with those windswept fish, not for a dinner party, but to survive until the next uncertain season. And the waste not, want not philosophy. It's more than a quaint saying your grandmother might have used. It was a stark reality. Every bone was boiled for broth, every apple core potentially saved for pectin, every wilted green considered for the pot. You see its fashionable echo in today's nose to tail or root to stem cooking movements. And while it's wonderful to embrace sustainability, it's a little different when you're choosing to confit a pig's ear with a pantry full of other options versus gnawing on boiled leather because there's literally nothing else. A light joke there, but the underlying truth is profound. The ingenuity born from such scarcity is remarkable. The influence on later diets is undeniable. Some foods that were once eaten out of sheer desperation, those foraged plants we discussed, or the less desirable parts of an animal, occasionally found their way into the realm of staples, or even delicacies. The humble potatoes, for instance, once viewed with suspicion in parts of Europe, became a lifesaver during lean times and subsequently a cornerstone of many national diets. It's a complex legacy. Of course, as over-reliance could also lead to devastation, but its initial adoption was often driven by the need for a calorie-dense crop that could grow in less than ideal conditions, and for a quirky, lesser-known tidbit. Some communities developed such an acquired taste for certain intensely flavored preserved, famine foods, like specific types of fermented grains or fish, that these items remained sought-after local specialties even when abundance returned. It's a testament to how adaptable our palates can be, and how memory and tradition can elevate the humblest of origins. Imagine a food that once symbolized hardship becoming a treasured part of cultural identity. Perhaps not unlike how some people still make coffee from roasted chicory root, a practice widespread during times of coffee scarcity. Necessity, the quirky mother of niche artisanal beverages. Historians still argue whether the profound dietary shifts enforced by periods of extreme need resulted in lasting epigenetic changes, subtly influencing the health and metabolism of subsequent generations. It's a compelling thought that the privations of your ancestors might still whisper in your genes. But beyond the specific foods and techniques, what this journey through necessity's kitchen truly illuminates is the staggering resilience of the human spirit. You see it in the clever ways people found to make the unpalatable palatable. You sense it in the sharing of knowledge, which berries were safe, how to best leach toxins from acorns, the secret to making a handful of grain last. Remember those communal village ovens we touched upon? They weren't just about baking bread. They were about shared warmth, shared resources, shared survival. It's about an ingenuity that often goes uncelebrated. There are no grand statues, generally speaking, erected to the woman who figured out how to make flour stretch further with powdered dried peas, or the man who perfected a way to store roots underground through the harshest winter. Yet, these small, persistent acts of innovation, of sheer stubborn refusal to give in, are what carried communities through. You see, it wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about maintaining hope, about finding a flicker of comfort and normalcy in a world that often offered very little of either. The ability to create something, anything. Nourishing from next to nothing is a profound act of defiance against despair. These stories of survival cooking tell us that humans are fundamentally adaptable. We can learn, we can innovate, we can endure when you strip away the comforts and conveniences. When you face the stark reality of needing to find sustenance from a seemingly barren landscape or a near-empty larder, something ancient and powerful within us seems to awaken. It's a quiet strength, a persistent, inventive spirit that whispers, "There must be a way." And more often than not, a way was found. It might not have been pretty, it certainly wasn't easy, but it was life. The legacy of Necessity's Kitchen, then, is not just one of hardship, but one of incredible, enduring, human tenacity. And as our journey through these dimly lit corridors of the past comes to a gentle close, you might find the shadows in your own kitchen feel a little different now. The simple act of slicing bread, of simmering a soup, of choosing what to eat from a place of abundance, carries with it the faint, soft echoes of countless generations who did so much with so little. Let the stories of their resilience, their ingenuity, and their quiet strength settle around you like a comforting, well-worn blanket. May the soft hum of your fan or the quiet stillness of your room allow these thoughts to drift and deepen, a gentle reminder of the enduring human spirit that finds a way, always. The lights are very dim now. The world outside fades, and a sense of peaceful understanding settles in. Thank you for walking this path with me. Sleep well.